All right, I hope everyone had fun with their maps. It's always fun to sketch out a map or try to represent all the different things that you're up to in a day. So we're going to finish off this kind of lecture, quote unquote, slides recording, talking about what maps allow you to control. Tried to emphasize this throughout the course, but you are in control of everything when it comes to GIS. You're in control of the map, you're in control of the data, you're in control of the colors, you're in control of the line width. Some of those things are maybe less impactful than others in terms of how your map works, what your map does, how people perceive the map at the end of the day. But they're all aspects that you control. You get to put everything in there, no one else. And that's a big responsibility in terms of what your maps are going to do, who's going to use them, how they're going to function. So you have control of things like content, area, emphasis, the focus on spatial relationships, the analog to the real world, and a lot of other characteristics. You get to choose whether or not your map is accessible. You get to choose whether or not your map is legible. You get to choose whether or not your map is representing the best data possible. You are limited in some of those characteristics. Say, for example, the data that you have. You can't represent data you don't have. Can't represent data that hasn't been updated. But then you get to decide how you note that as one example. So we're going to look at some of these examples throughout the rest of this recording. Maps contain many multitudes in terms of how they function. They are used for communication. They are artifacts of different time periods, different cultural epochs, different technological components. Maps are political. Maps create and maps destroy. Maps are tools. Maps are foundational components of how we interact with each other and the planet. And, you know, birds and trees and animals and oceans and all those things too. We experience through maps. And it's very important not to lose sight of that. It can feel kind of rote. You can get into the trenches of making a map and figuring out the right shade of blue to use, so on and so on. And it doesn't feel maybe at times that maps are these powerful entities. But in every map, there lies power. And you, the cartographer, are therefore very powerful. Here's two maps of our lovely state of Massachusetts here. These maps have very significant differences in content. They are both maps of Massachusetts. If someone said, I need a map of Massachusetts, and you gave them either of these, that'd be fine. It'd be great. These are maps of Massachusetts. Cool. One of them in the top right is definitely road oriented. It even says road map of Massachusetts up there. We can see just through some basic cartographic notes that we have some roads of different kinds. There are thick red lines and thin red lines. And there's a green line. What makes the green line different from the red lines? Answer that to yourself while I make a dramatic pause. You can speak it out loud. What is different about the green line than the red lines on this map? All right, I think you spoke it out loud. Right, it's a toll road. That's the Mass Pike. It's a toll road. You pay money to ride on that, drive on that, whatever you do. Whereas all these other ones are not toll roads, so they're a different color. Thicker lines are interstates, thinner lines are other types of highways. Some choices were made between these two maps. Map lower left has different cities and towns on it than the map top right. Let's see. Dalton makes it on that lower left map, but not in the top right. South Hadley instead of Hadley, so on and so on and so on. Map lower left gives us more political context. We know that there are county seats. That's not represented in the map top right. We also get the county boundaries. We also get a zoom in of urban Boston. Both of these are maps. Both of these are reference maps, is probably the way I'd classify these. Different data, different information. Is either of them wrong? No, not necessarily. Are either of them right? Probably. They show different things. They make different content emphasis. That's Texas. This is a map of change in population by county in Texas. Green population up, purple population down. There's a similar idea. This is just total population. What data do you want to show? What story do you want to tell? We could use these together, kind of get an idea that, oh, it tends to be the larger counties that are growing. The smaller counties are shrinking. I think that generally holds. So sometimes you need two maps to tell the whole story. This is a great map. Southeast Asia, India, parts of China. See a little bit of Malaysia there, a little bit of Indonesia. This map is sometimes a little shocking because, well, what direction is at the top of this map? That's right. South is at the top of this map. Is that some kind of political cultural statement about north-south developing countries? I don't know. Could be. Or it could just be a cool, different way of thinking about India and Southeast Asia. Perspective is another control of maps we have. We can control the area that we show, how we show that area, the perspective we show that area from. These maps focus on spatial relationships. We're going to pull these up on the different screens, and these slides are, of course, available for you to click through as well. Here's a map of the Tube, the London Underground, the subway system. And in this map, we see the relationships of all the different tube lines, and then the zones, let's say, of where you're going. So if you're in kind of central London here, we can see that there's zone 1 here. And then as you go out, there's zones 2, 3, and so on and so on. So like if you go out to Heathrow, that's zone 6. Heathrow's the big airport. Go out to Chesham, that's zone 9. It's got to be super, super expensive, I guess. Nice little loop out here in zone 4. Snaresbrook and Chigwell. Oftentimes, transit maps like this reject geography, reject the traditional arrangement of things which show, distances as accurate. This shows stops. The most important thing when you're on a subway, how many stops until I need to get off? If I'm at Piccadilly Circus and I need to get to Knightsbridge, 1, 2, 3 stops, done, check. I don't necessarily care how far that is in like human distance. It's 3 stops. The network's a little different. if we wanted a geographically accurate version, we'd get a map something like this. Now we can see real distances and actually see that Chesham is indeed quite far out there. Heathrow is a haul. Piccadilly Circus to Knightsbridge isn't that far. This looks a lot different than this, which is organized based on network relationships. This one's based on spatial relationships. But how many times have you needed to know the spatial nature of the landscape above you when you're traveling underground? Maps can be adjusted to show the content that you want to emphasize. Another way maps function is through communication, or I guess all maps are communicating, but sometimes maps function primarily as supplements to other types of communication, is the better emphasis for this. This is in French. So pull out your French if you've got some. The general idea of this carte figurative is that once upon a time, in 1812 and 1813, Napoleon decided to invade Russia in the middle of winter. This is never a good idea historically. And Napoleon started with all of these troops, 422,000, at the Niemer River. And they marched. And they marched, and it was cold. And they marched, and the numbers keep going down. And it was cold, and they marched, and the numbers keep 175,000, 145,000. As it turns out, heading to Moscow in the depths of winter when it's cold isn't very good for troop morale or survival. And so 100,000 made it from 422,000 that started, and then they came back, and the graph gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you're at 25,000, 12,000. I don't know where these extra folks came from, 8,000. This is not only a map, it is a weather report, it is troop movements, it's a military artifact. Maps communicate multitudes. This is very much an early infographic. All those BuzzFeed quizzes owe themselves to this and some other pieces. This is a political map. If you've ever followed the US election, you've seen this. Blue states, red states. The foundations of American politics for ages. That's how the BBC saw the election. This is how Sky News saw the election. It's just awful. This is a cartogram. This emphasizes not population or not area of land, but population. So this is a cartogram from 2016. And I actually really like this link because it shows the different ways that the presentation of the information tells us a story. So this is the 2016 election. This author has Mark Newman here, who's actually a physicist, has these maps going back to the 90s, but I've never seen the 2020 version. But here is just the states. Here are the states as cartograms. Cartograms emphasize some other aspect than area. In this case, it's population. So we know that Massachusetts is a small state by land area, but it's actually a large state by population. So we get warped. California, the largest state, looks the biggest here. But we also know in the US that we don't elect people by their votes. We elect them by electoral votes. So now we see the electoral value of these states. And so we can see how a state like Wyoming, which has very few people, actually has more electoral power. We could keep going and go by county. Who won each county? We could go by county by population. Who, and then we start to see, like, that's Houston right there, huge city. A fairly large county, you know, county-wise. But even bigger population-wise. Or we could go to colors, and not just red or blue in the binary sense, but red to blue with purples in between. Very few counties, I don't think any county voted 100% for either candidate. Most fall somewhere in the middle. There's the middles. Oh, and there's a cartogram of the middles. Here's a different way of choosing how to display that information. Okay, we're gonna make red and blue obvious when there's a big winner, 70% or more. Then we'll make the purples more obvious where it was a tighter race. These are all maps of the same thing, the results of the 2016 election. You can imagine which map then President Trump put in his office, in the Oval Office. This one, big, red. You can imagine which maps show the nuances and the reality of the popular vote, which President Trump did not win. Nuance, details. All of these are the same type of map. All of these are the same information. Here's that 2020 race again. But how you style the information, how you put that information into a map changes the messaging a lot. Whoops. Another little graphic here just on changes. This was how the Washington Post showed those changes as little arrows drifting in the wind. And as you can see here, from 2016 to 2020, a lot of our changes were blue, which we know is the traditional representation of the Democratic Party. Or at least it has been since the 1900s, but I'm recording these too late in the evening to want to go on that tangent right now. Maps create. After World War I, the remnants of the Ottoman Empire were carved up by the victors, France, Britain, the allies, quote unquote. One of the things they did was draw a line in the sand. France gets this part, Britain gets this part. Enjoy. As we know, the Middle East is much more complex than a line connecting point A and B. Maps create because they can be imposed. The map says you're on this side of the boundary. The map says that's my territory. So we have to think about maps not only for what they can create and destroy, but who's using them as tools for creation and destruction. It can be very deep in terms of how maps are used for this type of political will. And you could argue political violence without much trouble as well. Are maps political? Absolutely. You can map politics with maps, obviously, but maps are political statements as well. Just a quick little story from the 2018 Olympics, Winter Olympics, Pyeongchang in South Korea. There's a number of disputed islands in this part of the Pacific Ocean. Islands that China claims, Taiwan claims, islands that Japan claims, that South Korea claims. Contested territories are their own mapping adventure. Go on to Google Maps, Russian Google Maps or Chinese Google Maps, google.cn or google.ru/maps, and you'll see that the world is different. Because those countries have certain standards or statements about what the world looks like. Because if Google wants to do business there, they better show the map the way they want to show it. And of course, the US or the UK or anyone else would have their ideas of what the map should look like. In this case, we're thinking about these tiny little islands between South Korea and Japan, Takeshima and Dokdo. Well, when the Olympic Committee for the Winter Olympics 2018 was putting together their maps for the 2018 Olympics, they wanted to make sure everyone knew that, okay, in the mountain cluster, here's where biathlon, ski jumping, the snow park, all that kind of stuff is going on. And then there's the Olympic Park at the coastal cluster. Here's where, all the ice skating and hockey and events like that were. Also, there's this cool island named Dokdo, just off the coast. You can't see it from the coast. It's not there. It's not visible. It was hosting no Winter Olympic events. But South Korean Olympic Committee definitely wanted you to know that that was part of South Korea. Even though it is historically bitterly contested between the South Korean government and the Japanese government. Dokdo is that little pin mark out there. Maps are political objects. Finish up just by one little question or one little idea on how maps are used in this way. Not only to push maybe a political agenda or create some kind of political reality. But the big idea is, and this is a great article to read for more on this topic, is that all maps lie. It doesn't matter if the map is a good map or a bad map. It doesn't matter if the map is designed well or designed poorly. It doesn't matter what the map is showing you. All maps are lies. Every map abstracts reality, how that reality is composed, and how it's represented. When you're making a map as a GIS person, you get to decide what reality people see. So for all of these lying maps, all of these distorting maps, a lot of decision-making goes into that. And you'll get to practice that throughout your GIS lives. It's easier than ever to produce a map. Anyone can do it. Anyone should be producing quote unquote good maps. There's a few more slides in here if you're interested on some functional ArcGIS stuff. Feel free to peruse those at your leisure. Otherwise, now that you've got the introduction, learned a little bit about maps and their milieu, done a little mapping activity, and now we've talked about what maps are. Liars, that's what they are. Feel free to jump ahead, watch that little cartography video before going through the lab document.